We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
This is Alan Garfinkel, your host for the Rock Art Podcast, episode 23. We are interviewing tribal archaeologist Jeremy Freeman, who works with the Standing Rock Lakota Sioux Tribe in North Dakota, and we'll have some remarkable reflections on his management and interaction with the Native people on a 2 million acre reservation. Welcome everybody out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is the 23rd episode of the Rock Art Podcast with your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, the founder and president of the California Rock Art Foundation. And as always, we always have an interesting and remarkable guest, and we're absolutely blessed and honored to have Jeremy Freeman here, who's a tribal archaeologist for the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe of North Dakota. He teaches anthropology, archaeology at Sitting Bull College, and works as an interpretive guide on the Mandan Indian Village in Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park in Mandan, North Dakota. He also founds an archaeological program and coordinator for a learning group. His BA is in anthropology from Heidelberg College. His MA is also in anthropology at Ball State University. And he's been what we call a professional archaeologist / cultural resources manager for over 20 years, working in various firms, museums, universities, all over the place. His passion in part is for public outreach. I think his passion as well is in the area of rock art studies and also the interface between Native heritage, indigenous cultural values, and the nature of anthropology and archaeology. And with that, I'll say hi to my old friend, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for that introduction.
Well, God bless you, Jeremy. I'm so glad we finally connected to do this. When last I saw you live, I think you were in a bit of a transition, weren't you? You know, your life was sort of open and things were developing, but you hadn't obtained this particular position, had you?
I don't think I had at that point in time. I think I was bouncing around at that time, mostly looking for employment. And I think it was sometime after that last time up there in Ridgecrest, I'd gotten a call from Standing Rock to come join the team here.
How'd you ever land such a prestigious position? I don't normally open with that, but I'm just curious.
Sometimes I ask myself that question as well. You know, and it's interesting. I was actually teaching a summer camp at Southwestern College, and it's in San Diego area this summer. And I did a phone interview for the position. And after the interview, I hung up and I texted my girlfriend. And I said, Yep, I'm not hearing from Standing Rock.
You really said that?
I did. I thought it was the worst interview I'd ever done. So
What that proves is sometimes the consideration of what we think is going on is not going on at all, is it?
it's true, and I must have said the right things. And
Exactly.
it's funny, oftentimes, my supervisor, he'll reflect on that. He remembers that interview. And
And what does he say?
apparently there were like 12, 13 candidates. And he remembers some of the questions he asked me, and I must have just kind of hit on the right ones. But I felt honored. He and I were doing a site visit at Custer National Forest. And something he said to me, he's like, no matter where we go, and I say this and I'm a truly humble person. He said this, no matter where we go, I hear you talking at a higher level than the archaeologists we encounter at these agencies. And he's like, I still feel to this day that we made the right choice in that interview.
What an amazing compliment, really. And based on our lengthy and sort of self-reflective, comments and conversations, I think he's right. I really do. I've always had a high opinion of you, and I think you have a depth of understanding and sophistication that is certainly remarkable. So here's the opening question, the $1 million question. How the heck did you get involved in this crazy cultural resource management, archaeology, anthropology, rock art thing that we call our profession? Where did it originate, and how did it emerge as a emphasis or passion for you in your life?
It was kind of like a moment in time. It was actually when I was young. I was in 6th grade, I think. It was my family took a family vacation, and we did kind of the cultural tour, but one of our stops was Colonial Williamsburg. And on our return trip, we stopped at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And
Yeah.
And while we were there, after we did the tour, and I was, of course, just kind of taken aback about, I had this real interest in history, was really cultivated at Williamsburg. But at Mount Vernon, we saw archaeologists working, behind the stables. And I know not everybody has this moment, but, I remember we went out to the wharf there on the Potomac River. And I said to myself, I wanted to pursue archaeology as a career.
And how old were you then?
Oh, probably 12, 13 years old.
That's amazing. Wow. That's quite a remarkable epiphany, I have to tell you, at that young and tender age, don't you think, Jeremy?
I think so. And it certainly had colored my early career. I actually, focused my studies on historical archaeology. And that was really where my particular passion was.
So you began as an historical archaeologist. So stepping back from that, how did you pursue your dream of a study in archaeology and history? Where did you begin to sort of, do that? Did you kick it off? Did you go to a particular college and get a degree?
I did. Yeah. I actually attended Heidelberg College. And the reason for that was there was a professor there who would become one of my undergraduate advisors, Dr. Mike Pratt, who had done a lot of work at a battlefield, which is kind of well known in the area I grew up. I grew up in northwestern Ohio, and there was a famous battle there, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And he had done some archaeological work there and had made the newspapers. And the main premise was that the monument wasn't necessarily memorializing the location of where the primary battle had taken place. And so he'd done quite a bit of work out there. And that really, with my interest in history, particularly in historical archaeology, I thought that was a good place to go. It wasn't necessarily a large university where I'd kind of get lost in numbers. And I don't regret that decision. I think my education at Heidelberg was quite fulfilling.
What degree did you get at Heidelberg?
I get a BA in anthropology.
And it was in anthropology. And then what?
And after that, I worked several years. I did several CRM jobs.
For those who are new to the, this particular realm, the word CRM stands for Cultural Resources Management. What the heck is that? What's Cultural Resources Management, Jeremy?
I mean, it's essentially doing archaeology for profit.
Okay.
But it's fulfilling the guidelines under the National Historic Preservation Act.
Yeah. We have to tell everybody, even though most people might know, but this acronym CRM, it's funny. We're trying to use that acronym for some of the work that the California Rock Art Foundation does. And they told me it's customer relation management. So he said, no, that's ours, CRM. So anyways, so you were involved in some work, some actual occupation, employment after the BA. And what other things did you do, or how did that go vis-a-vis advancing your career or your background?
Well, I spent several years doing that, and had been working on preparing my materials for grad school and all that.
Okay.
I'd actually participated in a couple interesting projects during that time. Shortly after I graduated, actually, another one of my undergraduate advisors, actually, just one day I went to volunteer. They're doing some lab work, and I just went to volunteer. I was still young and green, and he asked me if I wanted a job. I was like, oh, yeah, I could use a job.
And
so I ended up spending, I didn't necessarily work, it was a seasonal job. I didn't end up doing it year after year. It would depend on my work schedule, but I ended up, that's really what really invigorated my interest in doing the public outreach, because it was doing archaeology, teaching youth the archaeological arts, the science of archaeology. We actually were working up at Johnson's Island. It was a prisoner of war camp for Confederate officers during the Civil War. And,
oh, wow. So again, it was historical archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, actually ended up writing my master's thesis on that site, looking at Confederate nationalism and how it was a nascent foundering of a particular ideology for the Confederate soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
So I had worked for him for several years, and most recently was in 2013. I would go back anytime I needed a job, or really, to be honest, anytime it worked in my schedule, because I had enjoyed working with them so much. It was always rewarding, and working with kids had always been rewarding.
And how old were the kids that you were working with?
They would range anywhere from about fourth grade of age to high school.
Okay, but young, very young.
Yeah. The majority of them were 5th through 7th grade.
Okay. And what did you teach them, and how did you teach? How do you go about teaching young people about the interface between history and archaeology? That's a good question, Alan.
That is a good question, because I've spent years evaluating that question and
trying to figure it out, right?
Absolutely. I really picked up a lot of really good input from working there. One thing, you want to focus on the hands-on aspects. And two, you want it to be what is often referred to in the literature as authentic education, where they're not just simulating, they're actually doing something, but they're actually learning something from the process. Whatever they may learn. I mean, you could tie it into the STEM education.
Give me an example.
Well, one thing I focus on a lot is looking at STEM education. So, when we're looking at science, you're practicing science.
Yeah.
Even if you're excavating, you use math and science when you're excavating, but developing a hypothesis and thinking things through and thinking through questions.
Using the scientific method then.
Absolutely. And I actually used some of that model that my advisor had used in a program that I had put together when I was working at Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center. And we were actually doing a program for Montessori students out of Houston, Texas. And one thing about archaeology is it's so broad and so vast, and we can utilize that in the multidisciplinary nature of it. No matter what the interest level of a student is, it has an application in every other discipline. And so what I did is I used rock art sites in that particular exercise. And what I did is I had the students go to different rock art sites, look at the rock art, categorize it, record the attributes of the rock imagery, and develop hypotheses. And then we gathered together, and through a peer review process, I just kind of led the discussion, but I had them talk about what their findings were with the group, and had them talk about, what the strengths and weaknesses are of their classification schema and things of that sort. So they were participating in the scientific process, and they were going through a peer review process with their peers, I think learning, about how science actually works using rock art.
I think that was absolutely brilliant. That's just amazing that you were able to sort of take this, fairly high level and sophisticated kinds of thinking, of applying the scientific method to students that were of that age, and just having them do a hands-on interactive kind of exercise. I bet that was just a blast for them. Did they have fun?
They did. I think they really enjoyed it. And, it was, I think it was really telling and I think rewarding when one of the actually not one, but multiple of the instructors, the Montessori school instructors who were accompanying them, came up to me afterwards and said, what you've done today is right in line with the types of education that we try to imbue these students with in the Montessori environment. And I took that as an extraordinary compliment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, where did you go next? I guess you're moving into your graduate element, aren't you?
I am. Yep. Bouncing around a little bit, but I'd worked for that undergraduate advisor. I'd also worked for Dr. Mike Pratt as well on a public archaeology project at Fallen Timbers, where we had actually volunteers come out from the local community, that Toledo community, with metal detectors and helped assist in that survey. It was really learned a lot about how to look at battlefield sites, because we found out quickly that traditional archaeology is almost virtually ineffective on battlefield sites. We found virtually nothing in our test pits, our test units. Most of the artifacts that were found were from the metal detectors.
Fascinating. Well, let's just sort of hold that thought. And then in the next segment, we'll get a little deeper into what your discoveries were. And then perhaps we can talk a bit about your current position, which must be remarkable. See you in the flip-flop.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Well, welcome back, Archeo Podcast fans. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel doing the Rock Art Podcast, episode 23, and this is the second segment of our program. We have a gifted scholar who's a personal friend. His name is Jeremy Freeman. He works as a tribal archaeologist with the Standing Rock Native people in North Dakota. Jeremy, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
So I think we got to sort of the benchmark of some of the things that you were involved with in the realm of public outreach. Now I think we should perhaps transition to your current position and maybe talk a bit about what it's like to be I guess you might call it a tribal archaeologist, or working with the TIPO. And what's a TIPO?
The TIPO is a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer or office, depending how you use it. And It was established as part of the amendments, the 1992 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act. Just a little trivia question here. Standing Rock was actually the first THPO office that was established after the 1992 amendments.
Wow. So a pioneer in all things then, vis-a-vis this provision of the federal statutes, correct?
Most certainly.
And so what does a tribal archaeologist do? How many archaeologists are there working at Standing Rock?
Unfortunately, it's just me.
I thought that was the answer, but I did not know. How big is the area that you cover for the Standing Rock Sioux Nation?
Just a little bit over 2 million acres.
2 million acres.
Correct.
So have you even seen all the country that's there in 2 million acres? I can't imagine. That's enormous.
It certainly is. And I have not yet. I've been actually all over the reservation for different projects, mostly because we have different agreements and different projects that are going on. Mm-hmm. And it's overwhelming, to be honest. To be honest, I had no idea what the job would entail when I accepted. I had no idea. And I had no idea how busy I would be.
How do you get familiar with 2 million acres of land, country. What is the environment like? Give us sort of a sense of the landscape there.
Oh, sure. So it's in the northern plains or the high plains, which is kind of a misnomer because they think of the plains, they're going to think of like a flat landscape. Certainly parts of North Dakota are, but where we are, it's an unglaciated part of the state, and it's quite striking. It's a dissected upland with relatively significantly relief. I mean, there's level areas. It's, of course, virtually treeless, except in the river valleys. It's mostly siltstone. There is a limestone bedrock, but it's not really necessarily a karstic area. So most everything that we're seeing is on the surface. There are rumors that there are some rock shelters and or caves here at Standing Rock. I have not yet ventured out to see where they are, but there are certainly areas like that are in the northern plains, especially towards western part of state.
What's the current fauna like? What kind of animals are out there, if any?
It's actually quite diverse. I was rather struck by, the diversity. There are anything from white-tailed deer to mule deer. There's actually a moose crossing sign. So there are actually moose here. There's elk, porcupines, of course, your kind of usual things, the raccoons and skunks. There are actually antelope.
Wow.
That we occasionally see running around.
Are there any bison, or are those all extinct, or were there ever any bison in that area?
There certainly were historically.
Okay.
There are today, but most of them are on ranches. There are some wild bison in Theodore Roosevelt National Park.
I see.
We actually here at Standing Rock actually have a couple bison herds. We've actually, one of the programs we've been talking about, mostly my supervisor, John Eagles, is a THPO, is talking about us getting involved in managing a bison herd and looking at traditional sustainable ways of maintaining bison herds.
Fascinating. So that's what the environment is. What do you do, Jeremy Freeman, as the sole archaeologist in 2 million acres on the plains in Standing Rock Sioux Tribe on the reservation? Is this all reservation land, per se?
Mostly.
Okay.
Most of the work that I do certainly is, although we do go off reservation for projects and, of course, for consultation. One thing, and this is something that I realized rather quickly, not that I hadn't understood this prior to assuming this role, but we, of course, act as the SHPO. So as per those 1992 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act.
That's a State Historic Preservation Office.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so we review any projects that are done within the exterior boundaries of Standing Rock Reservation.
Okay.
And then we also conduct our own work as well. But we also consult on projects that are well beyond the boundaries of Standing Rock. Traditionally, the Lakota people had a very wide area. And so anything within the treaty territory, Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, anything within their ancestral lands, these are all of concern to the tribe. And so we engage in consultations with various agencies. I've been in consultations down in Colorado, as far as Trinidad, Colorado, doing consultation there. Of course, we work very closely with some of the agencies here in North Dakota. We get inundated with mail. We don't just get a couple letters a day. We get boxes of mail.
Boxes of mail. What does a box of mail mean? How many pieces of mail are in a box? 50, 100?
Probably anywhere between 50 to 100 reports that might come in a box.
A day?
A day, yeah.
Oh, my word.
Obviously, we can't possibly review them all, but what we try to do is we try to pick the ones that are of greatest concern, that we want to get involved in, or we want to have greater consultation in. And so for those of you out there who send letters to TIPOs, if you're disappointed, you say, oh, they never respond. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not looking at them, but we're limited in our time when we have virtually hundreds and thousands of reports coming in and trying to get our own projects done. It can be very challenging.
So you're like a one-armed paper hanger.
I kind of am. And so in addition to that, doing reviews for letters, we write concurrence letters. I also do NHPA or Section 106 compliance work here at Standing Rock. We run it just like we do any other CRM business. I put together a cost estimate. The one difference is that it has to go through approval process. We receive the RFPs, the request for proposals, and then I prepare a cost estimate based on what I think it'll take to conduct and complete a Class 3 cultural resources inventory. And then I have to submit that cost estimate along with the proposal to our committee. So we actually report to the economics committee. And I've been sitting before many times describing the project, giving them a little details. And once it gets approved in committee, then that committee will then take it to council before we can actually proceed with the project. And then I actually submit that cost estimate to the client. And if they approve, I send them a contract, they sign it, and then we conduct the work.
So, in other words, when you say client, is it that someone is planning on doing something on tribal land, and then to meet the mandates of the National Historic Preservation Act, they have to evaluate and consider the cultural resources. And so that is done by your office or on contract? How is that handled?
It's done largely by our office. We, of course, operate under the auspices of the National Historic Preservation Act, but we also have additional tribal law, namely Title 32, which is the Cultural Resources Code, that we also operate under. And within that code, we do require 100% survey of any sort of project that's going to be taking place within the exterior boundaries. So this does include a home site. So when
home sites, okay,
some of the tribal members are applying for a home site, it's on trust land. So they will go through the application process. And part of that process is actually having the THPO office conduct the cultural resources survey for that. And since the policy is that if they're tribal members, we conduct that service at no charge to them. So we are often busy conducting surveys like that for those type of projects.
So these are for smaller projects for the homes, but you also, I guess, must be involved with larger projects as well that have other sorts of clients, don't they?
We do.
What might those be?
They can vary. Anything from telecommunications tower. We did a couple cellular tower surveys this past year. We actually just finished up a survey for the municipal and rural and industrial water supply for a 26-mile pipeline.
Wow.
We're actually just working on some reroutes and looking for possible routes to avoid impacts to sites today. We just completed a couple surveys for the two airports here at Standing Rock.
So you got all these various clients, and somehow you evaluate the projects and they have to end up paying you if they're not tribal members. What do you discover, and what sorts of things might rise to the threshold of something that someone might have some interest in the rock art realm?
Certainly. My research interest now is in rock art. We certainly do have some of the traditional rock art that what most people think of as rock art, the petroglyphs and pictographs. But there are other forms of rock art too that are possibly less well understood, one of which is what's known as a petroform. And this is actually the arrangement of rocks varying in size, anywhere from 10 centimeters to we've seen some rather large rocks, that were probably originated as glacial erratics. And they're incorporated into these features so that they're consist of rock alignments that are used for ceremonial purposes. We've seen them arranged in rock alignments, in effigies, and a variety of things. There's rock alignments out there that actually just mark places of power. And we see these actually all over the place where they're doing different ceremonies, such as the Humblecha ceremony or things of that sort, where young men were being tested. It could be somewhat more recently. See, we don't know how old some of these features are. So in some ways, we know that some of these are related to constellations. And we are starting to see more and more as we start to learn the constellations. We're seeing, I've seen this before, and they're actually mirroring what we see in the sky. We actually recently did a site visit where the constellation that corresponds with the Pleiades, it was known as the Wichinchila Shakoi, the three sisters.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I'm saying not three, the seven women. Yeah. Shakoi is seven. So it was there. It was actually created on the landscape.
So the petroform itself is a rock alignment is it a mirror or a representation of what we see in the sky with rocks? Is that what you're talking about?
They are. They're a representation of the different constellations within the Lakota cosmology, what's referred to oftentimes as Lakota star knowledge.
You were privy to this from the traditional knowledge holders, I presume, the elders or those that are people that understand the sacred knowledge and the worldview of the native people. And then they could help you understand what you're discovering, I presume. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, as an outsider, I'm not necessarily privy to all that sacred knowledge. They certainly share a great deal with me, and I'm always grateful for anything that they share.
Right.
I realize more and more, not that I had ever thought I knew everything, but I realize there's so little that I do know. As I interact with them more and more, it's really opened up my perspective and changed how I look at archaeology and rock art in particular.
So working with Native Americans has caused you to sort of dismantle your structure of knowing and humble yourself, doesn't it?
It most certainly does.
Okay, we're going to go to the break and come back again, and we're going to probably drill down on some of these very specific discoveries and find out what we think we know about them and why.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Well, this is segment 3. We'll be finishing up here for episode 23. This is your host for the Rock Art Podcast, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, with our guest scholar, Jeremy Freeman, who is the sole tribal archaeologist, as we have learned in this interview, for a 2 million acre reservation for the Standing Rock folk in North Dakota. Jeremy gave us a little snapshot of the environmental elements of that part of the country. It is indeed on the plains, but he revealed some other interesting sidebars. Jeremy, why don't you tell them a little bit about the climate and temperature variation in this part of the world?
Certainly. When I was growing up in Ohio, I'd always seen the weather in the upper plains. And I was like, I'm just glad I'm not there, And now here I am. It's a strikingly beautiful landscape. But when winter hits, it really hits. The winters are no joke here.
And you just told me it's very long. It starts when?
We get our first snow in October, and then we don't see the ground again, and usually until late April or sometimes early May.
And you say that the temperatures are dramatically cold, correct?
They are.
What's the average and what's the most extreme?
I'd say that the average during the winter, I'd say it's just an estimate, I guess. I'd say it's probably in the single digits below zero, probably anywhere 0 to 10 below. But it gets, of course, extremely cold. So there was about 2 weeks straight last winter. It was about 30 below.
2 weeks straight?
Yeah.
Wow. And as I said, tongue in cheek, I said that's when you get all your field work done because it's such a great time of the year. And you're saying, yeah, you got to get your field work done before that so that during that period, I guess you do a lot of analysis and write-up, I presume. Is that correct?
Mostly, yeah. Although I have to, of course, write reports during the height of the season as well, which is unfortunate because our field season is so limited here. It's fortunately, I'd gotten kind of used to California where the field season really just never ended. And unfortunately here we have probably about 5 or 6 good months where we can really hit it, knowing that if we have a workload that it's going to be a challenge to try to accomplish, everything that we need to do. But, during the winter, it is an opportunity to catch up on some of the report writing and as well as some of the other projects that we have ongoing here at the tribe.
Let's drill down in this last segment and talk about those. One of the things you mentioned that you think was, I'd say, very engaging and very, very interesting are these petroforms that have sacred significance and some of the things you've learned about them or hope to learn and how you go about discovering them and learning more about them. And I'll let you take that and run with it. We learned in the last segment that petroforms are basically rock alignments, and they have rocks that are identified in different sizes. But I presume that for you to do what you do by way of discovery and interpretation, you certainly need some guidance, I would presume, from the native people themselves.
Absolutely. And yeah, I couldn't do it without them. And I 100% agree. My supervisor, he's a Lakota, and he makes the case to the archaeologists and agencies with whom we partner and consult with that the native people have a unique experience. They draw from a different database, and that's often a different database than archaeologists do. And it's an analogy that he often uses. And I agree.
Explain that, please. Explain the native database, that what it's like to be a native person as a Sioux, as Lakota, and how that differs from sort of our contemporary understanding of, cosmology, the universe, our life ways, all the above. What is different and what is telling and significant to our understanding of these archaeological features and the rock art, both as petroglyphs, pictographs, and of course the petroforms, these rock alignments, please.
So we actually have a cadre of other staff. So I don't actually do it all myself. I rely heavily on our seasonal staff, and we refer to them as traditional cultural specialists. They get compensated actually relatively well. They get paid $50 an hour, and they work under my guidance. And
what do they do?
They actually help assist in the site identification,
Okay,
as one of the steps of the Section 106 process. And so I couldn't do the work without them, to be honest. Most archaeologists that work out here in the plains, they don't recognize these petroforms as being sites because, to be honest, and when I first started seeing them, I found it challenging as well myself, because differentiating a cluster of rock from glacial erratics from these that have been deposited naturally, that things are eroding out of the turf. It's very challenging.
Yeah, so trying to see what differentiate the natural phenomenon from the cultural phenomenon, you need these traditional cultural folk who have an intimate knowledge of the religious metaphors, correct?
Correct. And the ones that we have working for us, it's not just anybody.
Give us some examples so we can really get an insider's view of what you're going through, please.
Sure. So and most of them, they've been brought up in this way of life. But the ones that we hire are ones that live this way of life. They've been inculcated in traditional cosmologies, in traditional life ways. They participate in ceremonies such as the Hablecha or such as the Sundance and things of that sort. They have 7 sacred rites here that they perform. Now, not all of them have performed all the sacred rites, but they've certainly started their journey in that. And so,
what are these 7 sacred rites, Jeremy?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I can recall what they all were.
Can you give us a sense of what those are, though? Are they coming of age rites? Are they challenges? What are they exactly? Is it a vision quest? What is going on with those sacred rites?
It's such a kind of a mixture of each of those. It's there are certainly a coming of age ceremonies that are performed, and there are other things that are meant to test you to see to test I guess your virtue. And the 7 sacred rites are really many various virtues that are held in high esteem in the Lakota belief system and the Lakota traditional ways. And each of these are meant to either test that or to establish that you retain these various virtues.
And how is that, or how is this sacred knowledge and this information, how does that translate into what you're finding on the ground vis-a-vis these petroforms and the archaeological record? If you can make that bridge for us.
Certainly, yeah. So the petroforms themselves are utilized in these various ceremonies.
Oh, okay.
One thing that we often find, and this is actually a conversation that John and I had when I first started here, is something you'll see in the literature throughout the plains is references to these teepee rings. Well, it turns out, and he's right, they're not teepee rings at all. You wouldn't expect teepee rings to be like in a perfect circle. The traditional hypothesis was that these were used to weight down the tents, that they lived in, and yet they still retain perfect circular nature. And one critique that he often uses is like, where do you find these sites? You find them up on these ridge tops, up on these terraces. And the analogy he uses is, we lived in an area where we were surrounded by enemies. Do you really think that we would be camping up on these highly visible terraces, where we're going to be seen by our enemies?
Pitching their tents.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that wouldn't be very smart. So what are they used for?
So they're actually used for different ceremonies that are being performed. And it might be a ceremony where there's a young man who's being tested. There's a circle that's created, and he is instructed to either sit or stand in that circle overnight, sometimes multiple days, with no food or no water. And it's testing his resolve. And I understand they keep a close eye on him, but if that young man doesn't pass the test, if he steps 1 foot out of that circle, he's not considered worthy, and he's not inculcated, he's not initiated into that particular next rank or that particular society or whatever it is that he was being particularly tested for. But they would often choose young men, young women who had particular aspects to them that they would perhaps even, not necessarily even willingly, they would subject them to these particular tests to see if they were able to pass on to that next particular rank.
Interesting. Okay, so I think I understand those teepee rings and those other rings associated with those ceremonies. You said sometimes that there's effigies. Are they effigies other than that celestial or astral element? Are there other kinds of effigies you've discovered?
Yes, there are, and some of them are quite stark. Some of them, they're there, and after they're pointed out to me, I was like, yeah, I see it. But many of them are animal effigies. So we'll see things such as turtles as a common one. These were used in fecundity rituals. Women who were trying to conceive or had conceived would often create these turtle effigies. Some of them are quite apparent. Some of them need a little bit of interpretation.
And why the turtle for fertility? Help me understand. That's one I don't know about. Why is the turtle associated with fertility and fecundity? Do you know?
That's a good question, and I don't necessarily know the answer to that.
I'm sorry I gave you a stumper. I humbly apologize. Let's move on to salamanders.
Certainly. So salamanders are associated with power and protection. And so and what's interesting is you don't necessarily often see these together, but we were just doing a site visit at Custer National Forest, and we actually saw the two together, like adjacent to one another. And I know John thought that was rather striking because he said, you have the power and the fertility, kind of side by side. Not necessarily things you necessarily associate with the same sort of activity, but it was rather interesting, and the interpretation there. I don't know if he had one necessarily or not, but it was it's kind of makes you think about, well, what was going on here? Why are we seeing these two? Are these contemporaneous? Is this a multi-component site? What was going on? We don't necessarily know, and that's one thing. And I know he and I both talk about this all the time, and we're kind of marveled. Unfortunately, that this field, as interesting as it is, can also be frustrating. But it raises more questions than it does answers. But it's the pursuit of those questions and the answers that drives us, and it's the most fascinating part of this field.
Now, offline, and even before your interview, you were telling me about some interesting developments in your role and working as the tribal archaeologist. I think you were talking about issues of sustainability and proliferation. Maybe as a closing, we only have a couple minutes, but I think you should talk about that. You remember the animals we were talking about?
Yeah. So one of the projects among any of these, I think we have grand visions for where we'd like to see the THPO program go. Where one thing I've been involved in is actually one of the many things is putting together grants. So I've been actually working on writing some grants. And one thing that we'd like to actually get a little bit more involved in is working with sustainable bison herds. We've actually have a close relationship that we've established with Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where they call the elk herds every year. And we've actually have a close working relationship with them where we're actually going to integrate traditional hunts and things of that sort with tribal members. And they're going to allow us to participate in that. Also with Theodore Roosevelt National Park, one thing that my John's really into is horses, traditional horses in particular.
Oh, wow.
They have a particular strain of horses that some scholars have traced, and we don't necessarily know how conclusive this is or how substantiated it is, but have traced these horses back to the Lakota, saying with claims that they are Sitting Bull's horses, that they are descendants of Sitting Bull's horses. Now, there isn't really a way to necessarily scientifically establish that, as far as I know, but it is interesting. And we do have actually some of these, they call them Nakota horses. We do have a small herd here at Standing Rock. But they're having problems with inbreeding at Theodore Roosevelt. So we've been talking about doing an exchange where we're going to have basically an exchange of genetic material. We're going to exchange horses to strengthen the herd.
That's amazing.
And that's another program that we're potentially going to be involved in.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time we have. I think we packed this particular program, the 3 episodes, with a tremendous amount of insight and wisdom and an amazing discussion about Standing Rock and Lakota theology and the relationship with cultural resource management and rock art studies. Jeremy, honor and a pleasure. You have anything you want to share to sign out with? I know I put you on the spot again. No, Alan, I can't think of anything after you put me on the spot here.
No, I think, one thing that it's been an honor and a pleasure for me to work here at Standing Rock. Of course, Standing Rock is kind of well known for the Dakota Access, and what had happened there. And that's something that I was only tangentially involved in. It was mostly over by the time I had arrived here, but we are continuing that fight. And it has, of course, it's reared its ugly head once again. We had a victory more recently where a judge had ordered that a full environmental impact statement, an EIS, needs to be conducted. And this is prior to the expansion of the capacity of that line. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. Thank you so much. I think we'll sign off. Thank you, all those people in Archaeology Podcast Land. See you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. You can find this podcast on the educational podcast app Lyceum, Lyceum, and wherever you find podcasts. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden and David Ian Howe.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.